So welcome to all of you, and welcome especially to those who are new this time. So our series this semester is on human nature, man made in the image of God. And for those of you who weren't here last week because of the weather, we're going to look at the natural, man made in the image of God, on the natural order. This spring, and God willing in the fall, we'll look at the supernatural order and our creation in grace, original sin, and our restoration through the grace of Christ. And that'll be for the fall. But before we do that, we'll look in this semester at human nature itself, which gives the foundation for understanding grace. And what that means is that this semester will be more philosophical, and next time more theological. And so this may be arduous. Philosophy is always arduous, but it's also very beautiful. Okay. And this talk tonight, we're going to look at the gift of the intellect. But since many of you weren't here last time, let me give a brief summary of what we looked at last week. And so last week's talk was on our place in the creation. Right? Where is man's place? And we said that our place in the creation is not what we often think at the top, but is where? Anyone? In the center, right in the middle of God's creation. We're the top of the physical world, but we're at the bottom of the spiritual world. Right? So we're above all the rocks and plants and animals, but we're below all the angels, and there are myriads of angels. And so we're right in the middle. And that's good for humility, that we're not the king of creation. We're the king of the physical world. And so we're right in the middle, the intersection between the material world and the spiritual world, because we belong to both. Right? We belong to both parts. And the philosophy sums that up in the definition of man. And what's the definition, the classical definition? Anyone? A rational animal. Right? Man's a rational. So, like the beasts, we're animals, but we're distinguished from them because we're rational. And because we're rational, we're spiritual. Right? And so, rational animals, it's like soul and body. And that marks the intersection between the physical creation and the spiritual creation. And that's beautifully said in Psalm number 8, in which the psalmist marvels at our place in the universe. You have made us a little below the angels, but you have set us over all the birds of the air and the plants and the beasts and the fish of the sea, etc. Right? So a little under the angels, but above all the animals. Right? And that's going to be important for everything that we see in this whole series. Right? That's our place. Okay. And last time we also talked about our other ways of looking at our place in the universe. And so we saw that God, when He makes things, He always makes things hierarchically, in an ordered way, like a staircase, like a ladder. And so God's creation always involves lower things and higher things in a beautiful progression. Right? And we see this so beautifully when we go to the zoo. Just simply the different orders of the animal world. Right? They're not all the same. God's creation isn't egalitarian. That would be boring. Right? Just as a symphony would be boring if it were just first violinists. And so God's creation is like a symphony in which there are all kinds of instruments. And there's a room for the first violin, but there's room for the triangle or the drum. And so He makes everything in a hierarchical way with grades. And we saw that in these grades, the higher things are more interior. Right? The lowest things, like rocks, there's no interiority at all. But the higher the animals have some interiority because they sense and they remember. But we have so much more interiority. But angels still more naturally, and obviously God is infinitely interior. And we saw that there were grades of openness. The lower things, like rocks, aren't open to other things. Right? They're just rocks, they're just what they are. Whereas plants are a little bit open, they take in things from outside, nourishment, and they grow and reproduce. But animals are more open because they take in sense knowledge. And we're far more open because we can grasp not only the things that we see and touch, but the universal. And that's what we'll talk about tonight. We take in universal ideas like justice and truth and beauty. And we're not limited to this particular thing like an animal is. And so we're so much more open. Okay, and then the last thing we looked at is our senses. And we saw, well, we have 5 external senses, but we also have interior senses. And we don't usually think about this or hear about it, but we have a sense, an internal sense that unifies whatever comes in through our external senses, that unifies it, and then we have imagination by which we retain and we can reconfigure and recombine whatever we've taken in. And we've got what we call the associative sense, by which we associate all kinds of other experiences with what we're experiencing now on the sense level. And then we have memory. Right? And that there's an organ for that, and that's our brain. Okay, but what we're going to look at tonight is the intellect. And that's above all of that. It's immensely above our senses. And we'll see in, not tonight, but 2 weeks, it doesn't have an organ, our intellect. We tend to think that use your brain, now when we talk about the intellect. And that's not right. The intellect doesn't use the brain because it's above the brain. But we'll get to that in 2 weeks. But tonight, let's look at what is knowledge. What is intellectual knowledge? Okay, so man is set apart from the brute animals by the gift of intellect, by having the gift of being rational, having intellectual knowledge. And so the first thing we want to do is understand, well, what does that mean? What is the intellect? And what does it mean to have rational knowledge or intellectual knowledge? And then, in other words, what's the difference between sense knowledge that we have in common with the beasts and rational or intellectual knowledge that we don't have in common with them, but which we have in common with the angels and with God? Right? So what's the difference? Right? And it's simple. The key difference is that sense knowledge is always of particular things, and intellectual knowledge is of universals. Let's just take an example. The cow sees a particular piece of grass, or the lion sees a particular deer and desires it. But we grasp deer. We grasp truth or justice. Not this particular one, but in general. And we can then see different individuals as being parts of that. So we can see this particular cow as being a cow. But our notion of cow isn't limited to this particular cow, but extends to all cows that could ever be. That's what we mean by intellect. That's intellectual knowledge, to know the universal. And that's what sets us apart from the beasts. Right? We take it for granted. We do it every day. Every minute of our lives, we're thinking with universal ideas. And animals never do. They can't. And we can't imagine that. Right? Whenever an author writes a book about animals, they'll always have the animal thinking with universal ideas, which they can't do. Okay, so sense knowledge is of particulars and intellectual knowledge of universals. And another difference is this. Sense knowledge grasps we could say the accidents or the appearances of things. But the intellect grasps what a thing is, its substance or essence. Right? And the accidents of a thing, I don't know, like someone's 5 foot. Right? My eyes grasp the accident. My eyes grasp somebody's wearing a purple whatever. But the intellect grasps a person, a human being, a woman, etc. Right? And those are universals. Okay, and then the third difference is that our senses always use a material organ. Right? Our exterior senses, our eyes, our hands, our ears, etc. But even our internal senses, our imagination, uses an organ, the brain. But our intellect doesn't directly use an organ. But we'll prove that in 2 weeks. So I'm building suspense there. Okay. Let's start with the difference between human intellectual knowing and that of the angels and God. Because we could say there are 4 levels of knowing. There's sense knowing of the animals. There's the human intellect. Then there's the angelic intellect. And then above that, infinitely above that, the divine intellect. And so those are 4 different ways of knowing. Right? And we're the second tier. Right? We're not the top. And it's important not to get mixed up of those 4 ways of knowing. If somebody were to think of human knowing like animal knowing, and that's common in philosophy, that would debase man as if he were just like a clever monkey, a clever chimp. Right? And that's perhaps what many of our contemporaries think. That would be to confuse human knowing with animal knowing. But you could also confuse human knowing with angelic knowing, as if we knew things like angels know. And some philosophers fall into that trap. Descartes, for those of you who have studied philosophy, falls into that. Thinking that we know everything by simply having these ideas, clear and distinct ideas, innate by nature. Well, that's how angels know. God, when He created the angels, He filled them with these innate ideas of everything. But that's not how we come into the world. Right? Our babies come into the world with blank slates, empty, and they need to be filled. Right? That's the human way of knowing. That's the human intellect. It comes into this world blank, and it's gradually filled through our sense knowledge, and we'll talk about that. And then above that, there's the divine knowing, and God knows everything through Himself. Right? So His knowing isn't received. He doesn't receive it from us. And so that's the fundamental difference between God's knowing and our knowing, is all our knowing is received. Right? It's received from reality. Whereas God, His knowing creates reality. His knowing is active. Our knowing is receptive. And now this may sound obvious, but this is the difference between 2 schools of philosophy. One called realism, and that's the right school, that we know reality, but we're measured by reality. And so our knowledge is true or false if it coincides with reality or not. But there's another school of philosophy called idealism, which has the idea that our minds create reality. Now, everybody knows by common sense that that's ridiculous. But nevertheless, the most famous philosophers of modern times held that view of knowledge, that our minds are like projectors, and we're projecting the world, each one of us. And it just so happens that our projectors somehow coincide. We project the same world. So it's Immanuel Kant, the most famous philosopher of modern times, perhaps. And what he's doing is he's confusing human knowing with divine knowing. God's knowledge is creative, creates reality. But our knowledge is receptive. It receives from reality. Right? And so we call that realism. Where do we get our knowledge from? Reality. What's the primary thing? Reality. That measures our mind. Whereas idealism would say, what's the primary thing? The idea. The idea is somehow creative. For God it is, but not for us. Right? So our intellect is receptive, right? But it's a tremendous gift. It's not active like the divine intellect, except for the things that we make. Right? Our intellect is active in that sense for our own creations. Right? The artist Michelangelo for his statue, the artisan for his craftsmanship. But when we know reality, we're receiving that from reality. Right? So we're under reality. We're not above it. But God is above reality. He creates it. Okay. Now, angels are also receptive like us. They have to receive knowledge from God. But God made them full of knowledge when He created them. So when the angels were created at the beginning, God made them fully knowing the whole natural order. So they don't find out. The only thing they find out is our free actions. Right? They don't know those. Okay, but the human intellect isn't like that. We said it comes to this world blank. A blank slate. Tabula rasa. And so if that's the case, how do we fill it? Right? So let's look at that. How do we come to know from not knowing anything to knowing, I don't know, like Einstein or St. Thomas Aquinas? And so here the key is our place in creation. Our place in creation is to be a rational animal, to be a spiritual being, but with a body. And therefore we're bodily spiritual creatures, we're rational animals. And so our intellectual knowing has to presuppose our knowing that we have in common with the animals in which we use our body, our sense knowledge. Right? So here's the fundamental principle. All of our intellectual knowledge that we'll ever get has its point of departure in our sense knowledge. And we have to first see and hear things. And from that sense knowledge, we abstract our ideas. It's called abstraction. But first we have to sense things. So if a person never had any sense knowledge because they were born blind and deaf and without smell or even touch, it's impossible, you could never ever get any ideas. And if you were just missing, say, 3 senses or 2, say you were blind and deaf like Helen Keller, it would be really difficult ever to get ideas. But she did get ideas because she had touch and smell. And so it's beautiful to read her life, how she had her first idea of water. So all our knowledge has to come first through our senses. But it doesn't stay there. Because Helen Keller, she didn't just feel the water. She grasped the idea, water. That applies to all water. And the same for every other idea. All right, so what is abstraction? Right, the word means separation or stripping. So when we abstract, what we're doing is we're stripping away what we're not interested in. We're stripping away what's not essential. And so we're actually losing a lot, but we're gaining something. So if I look at a particular person, I see all kinds of individual things. Their color hair, their height, their eye color, their skin color, etc., their clothes. And all of that doesn't belong to human being. And a human being doesn't have to be 5 foot or 6 foot or white or black or blonde or brunette, etc. And so to grasp human being, I've got to strip all of that away. Everything that's merely individual or accidental. I strip it away so I get what's essential, what every human being has in common. And we do this naturally. We take it for granted. We do it all the time. And we don't know how we do it. Good thing we trip and fall on our face. No, if we had to think how we do it. But we have this power to strip away whatever is accidental and grasp the essence underneath, as it were, that all human beings say have in common, or all plants have in common, or all rocks have in common. Right? So I see a particular rock and it's got a particular color and weight and size and shape, and I strip all that away and I'm left with the essence of rock that applies to every rock, and that we call abstraction. Right? And that's something that the animal will never, ever, ever do. The smartest chimp, the most intelligent dolphin will never be able to do that. Right? They can do all kinds of things. We can train them to unbelievable tricks, but they'll never strip away the accents to grab the essence and then say, dog. No, even something as simple as that. And we talked about this last time. There was an article in the New York Times about 10 days ago about somebody who was training a dog. And this dog trainer spent a lot of time. Spent 4 or 5 hours every day for 5 years training his dog. I forget the dog's name. And he taught the dog 2,000 words. And so this was an article in favor of animal intelligence. But it turned out, if you read the article, that all of these words that the guy taught the dog were particular. They were proper names. So he taught the dog the names of 200 different dolls. And the dog knew to go to each one of the dolls. So if the doll's name was A, the dog would go to that one, or B, or C, or whatever. But he could never teach the dog doll, or anything like that. No universals, just particulars. Right? Because that's sense knowledge. It's marvelous sense knowledge. Right, so abstraction goes above that. It grasps the essence. And this is where we get the name intellect. Intellect comes from Latin, to read within. Right? It's as if our intellect goes below the surface. The surface of things is where we get the accidents. 5 foot, 6 foot, white hair, black hair, white skin, black skin. But the intellect reads inside the thing to see human being, humanity, or even dog or pig. What the essence of a thing is. Plant or rock. And how do we do that? Well, we're given human nature that has that capacity. And it's like philosophers compare it to a light. And with our eyes, we can only see something if it's lit up, if there's light. And that's physical light, But we've got an intellectual light that enables us to see other things that an animal will never see. And that's the universals. Right? These universal ideas. And so we've got an intellectual light to see that. And where do we get it from? We get it from God. Right? It's a participation in His intellect. It's a tiny share, right? A minuscule participation, but a real one. Right? So it's a gift of God. Now, what I just told you, abstraction, is Aristotle's solution to the question, how do we know? But it's not, and it seems obvious to us once we know it. But it wasn't so obvious for philosophers. And one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Plato, didn't see it. And he came up with a different solution to how we know that's clearly wrong. But it's interesting. He thought that all our knowledge comes from remembering. Remembering what we knew in a past existence, in a past life. And he thought, therefore, we must have existed before this life in a higher life, a life in which we saw the ideas themselves. Right? Here we see an individual tree. He thought we must have previously existed in another place, the place of the ideas, where we saw not a particular tree, but the idea of tree. Now, we know this is false for various reasons. One reason, because we didn't exist before our conception. Right? It's not as if we existed in some prior state. Plato, believed in reincarnation. A modified kind of reincarnation, a kind of reincarnation that involved a fall from a higher state, an angelic state. He basically thought we were like angels and fell into these bodies as a result, I suppose, of some sin in our prior state. Anyway, all of this is false. So if we don't get our knowledge from some prior life, from remembering, where do we get it from? Well, Aristotle answered, we get it from our senses, but transcending our senses. In other words, we start with our senses, but we pull out the essence that's hidden in sense knowledge. Right? My sense knowledge, take an example. I see each one of you with my sense knowledge, my vision. Hidden in what I see is the essence of all of you, humanity. That's hidden under your forms, under your sensible, under your colors. And the intellect grasps what's hidden by stripping away what's merely accidental or individual. Okay? And that's abstraction. And it's a marvelous gift. Right? It's what sets us apart from all the animals. Right? So our knowledge isn't simply remembering. It's actually a new thing. We're coming to something for the first time. And we're coming to it through this power of abstraction. Right? And then once we've abstracted, we can retain that in memory. And how do we do it? Because the essence of things is in all of these things that I see. Right? My eye can't get the essence. My eye just gets the accidents, the appearances. But hidden under those appearances of each one of you, there's an essence. Humanity. It's there. And so what the intellect does is simply uncover what's there by stripping away what's hiding it, as it were. Right? It's there. And this is where Aristotle differed from Plato. Plato thought that the essence was just in this other world, the divine world of the ideas. Whereas Aristotle says, no, everything has an essence in it that makes it what it is. And our intellect is what grasps that, right? Uncovers it. Okay, and so we call it the power of abstraction. And we've all got it. And babies start to use this when they're 1 year old. Right? When a baby starts to say its first words, for example, if it says mama, or light, or hot, or something like that. Our son's first word was fan. Ridiculous. But when he says fan, he's got a universal. Right? He's got an idea that's intellectual knowledge. He's abstracted something from this fan and that other fan, and he understands it in all. Right? And so that happens about 1 year old, or younger even. But there first has to be sense knowledge. Right? And the brain has to develop to a certain extent so that there's internal senses, there's imagination and memory. And that's the starting point. And that's why somebody whose brain is damaged will have trouble using their intellectual knowledge, because the starting point of intellectual knowledge is sense knowledge, and above all, our internal senses, our imagination, association, and memory. Right? And so if that's damaged or handicapped, well then, so will our intellectual knowing. Even though our intellect is spiritual and doesn't have an organ that you can damage. But we'll come back to that in 2 weeks. Okay. I'm going to add another step now. There are 3 operations of the intellect. 3 things that the intellect does. 3 kinds of things. The simplest that we've just been talking about is abstraction. Philosophers call it simple apprehension. It's forming an idea, forming a concept. And that's the simplest thing. And a 1-year-old child already does it. That's the first operation. The second is when we put concepts together to make a sentence. And a 2-year-old does that. And we call that judgment. Say, I remember our son's first judgment, or maybe one of his first. He was going down the line. We were walking home from church, and he was saying, car, 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 car. Right? Those are just, that's simple apprehension, right? Just concepts. But car, car, and then he stopped for a second. Actually, it's a van. That's a judgment. He's connected 2 concepts. This is a van. And so that's the second operation of the mind, when we put together concepts to make a judgment. This is or isn't. And so the essence of a judgment is or is not. Putting together. And then the third operation of the mind is putting together judgments. You put together 2 judgments so as to draw out a third. And we call that reasoning. All men are mortal. I'm a man. Therefore, I am mortal. That's a reasoning. That's the third operation of the mind. And kids do that when they're about, I suppose, 3. And when we can do that proficiently, we call that the age of reason. Right? So those are the 3 operations of the mind. And each one supposes the other. You can't make a judgment if you don't have concepts. And you can't do reasoning if you don't have judgments. Right? So each one is a building block. But you can't do any of them if you first don't have sense knowledge and imagination and memory and association. Okay? So everything, it's so beautiful how each higher thing builds on a lower thing. And all of them are necessary. All right, let's look now at the first thing. Simple apprehension, grasping concepts. So what is a concept? A concept is grasping a nature, an essence, a substance, something universal. And concept is the fruit of that first operation. What do I mean by that? Every operation produces something, no? And when we think, we produce something where? Inside. Right? When we make a house, we produce something outside. But when we think, we're producing something that stays inside. That's our idea, our concept, by which we know the things that are outside. And we do it all the time, and yet we never stop to think about it, because we do it naturally. And this thing that we produce inside, the concept, is a likeness of the object that we know outside. So I see a cow. I think cow. I produce a concept inside that represents the cow outside and all cows. We do it all the time. We take it for granted, but it's marvelous. And so why do we call it a concept? Well, the name comes from to conceive. Why? Because It's as if we're conceiving something inside. It's like having a baby. It's reproducing something, but it stays inside. We talked last time, for those of you who were here, or for those who weren't here, we said that there were two kinds of operations. There's an operation that makes something exterior, like a house or a bridge, and then there's an operation that doesn't make anything exterior, but it has a fruit that stays inside, a product that stays inside. And the best example is a concept or an idea. Right? We do an operation, thinking, and we produce something, but it's invisible, it's spiritual. It stays inside of us and enriches us inside. And so, take, St. Thomas Aquinas. His intellect, by all of his operation, is enriching his interior. Right? And the same thing would go for all of us, to different degrees, to the degree of our wisdom. Okay, so we call it concept because it's something we conceive inside, and that stays inside, like a baby. And in fact, Socrates, when he was talking about teaching, he says, what's the role of the teacher? He says it's to be a midwife. Why is that? Because I can't make somebody else that. I can't take my idea and put it in your head. It's got to come out of each one's head, right? It's got to be conceived in each one, in the mind of every person. And so what the philosopher or teacher tries to do is to help the listeners to give birth to an idea inside their own mind. Right? So it's like the teacher is like a midwife to help you give birth to an idea. Okay, a concept we can also call a mental word. It's like a word that's not said outside, but it's like a word that we think inside. A mental word. Dog. I can say it out exteriorly, but before I say it, I can think it. And I can think it even without language. And that's why I can translate from one language to another, because I've got the thought independently of English or French or German or Italian. And so I can translate it into all of those. And we'll say more about that in a minute. Right? So we call this interior operation an imminent action or an interior action, as opposed to an exterior action or a transitive action. And interior actions are higher. They're better. Right? We tend to think that, obviously, we need exterior actions that make houses and bridges and food and so forth. But nevertheless, the interior actions are nobler because they're what's proper to God and the angels. Okay. Now this concept that we form, say dog, whenever we think dog, we do two things, and this is what tends to be confusing. Whenever I think about dog, I think an abstract universal idea, but at the same time, I have to use my imagination to imagine a particular dog to serve as an example for my universal. Right? So when I think dog, and at the same time I imagine, say, Spot, or, I don't know, Snoopy, something like that. And the two accompany each other, but they're not the same. And so it's really important not to confuse the imagination image, my Snoopy image, from my concept dog. Because my concept dog applies to all dogs, but my image only applies to, say, Snoopy. And so they're not the same. But I can't think dog without imagining some kind of particular dog. And why is that? Because we're rational animals, because of our place in the universe as body and soul, a union of body and soul. So we can't use our intellect without at the same time using our imagination. But they're not the same. And a clear example of this is when we think angel. What do? I think angel, and I recognize an angel as a pure spirit, but I form a mental picture in my imagination of a being with wings. I'd say Raphael or something. And I know that angels don't have wings, but my imaginative image has wings. It's a metaphor for flying through space or not being limited. And so my idea of angel is not the same as my imagination image of angel. But I have to think them both at the same time, because that's our human condition. Angels don't. They don't need those images of the imagination. Now, very often, one of the biggest reasons why people make mistakes in philosophy and theology is we rely too much on our imagination. So if we try to say we're thinking about God, and we want to imagine what we're talking about, well, what's going to happen? Our imagination, if we're not careful, will lead us into all kinds of errors of thinking about God as if He were some kind of bodily being and limited as we're limited. And so we always have to purify our imagination whenever we do think about higher things. Okay, so the key point here is that our concepts are coupled with imagination images, but they're different. They have different properties. The imagination image is particular, and the concept is universal. Okay? The imagination image has accidents, and my concept is got the essence. Okay, our concepts are signs. It's a special kind of sign. It's a representation of reality. So what's a sign? A sign, we all know, is something that points to something other than itself. Something that represents something other than itself. Right? That's a sign. And so our concepts are also signs. They represent reality. Right? They point to reality. Now, so it's helpful to think, well, what kind of a sign is a concept? It's a special kind of sign. Philosophers distinguish two kinds of signs: conventional and natural. A natural sign is something that naturally represents something else because of a natural resemblance, a natural similarity, or a natural connection. So a photograph represents, it's a natural sign of what it's a photograph of. Or if I make a statue, it's a natural sign of whatever I've made a statue of. Or if an artist makes a painting, it's a natural sign of what he's representing. Or smoke is a natural sign of fire. Footprints are a natural sign of somebody having walked. Trembling could be a natural sign of fear or cold or something like that. But there are other signs that are conventional, like our words, our spoken words or our written words, or say traffic signs. So a stop sign or a green light or red light, they signify only if we know already the meaning. Right? And that's why before you get your driver's license, you better pass the test that shows you know what a stop sign means. Because it's conventional. Right? It could be done totally differently. Green could mean stop and red could mean go. So that's a conventional sign. Okay, our concepts, what kinds of sign are they? Natural or conventional? If we said they were conventional, then they would only mean something insofar as we all get together and agree. And we'd have to, a conventional sign, you have to, in some sense, know it first. So, for example, like words are conventional signs, like, I don't know, in English, blue. But in another language, you say it differently. And in fact, you can say it in hundreds of different ways, in hundreds of different languages. And those are conventional signs. If our concepts were like that, our knowledge would have no natural foundation. And so it's really important that our concepts are natural signs. not conventional. But our words are conventional signs. And so it's actually a word, say man, is a conventional sign of a concept, which is a sign of a reality. And then there's a written word, man, if I write it out, M-A-N. That's a sign of a sign of a sign of a reality. Right? So a written word is the sign of a spoken word. And the spoken word is the sign of a concept. And the concept is the sign of the reality. And so concepts are natural signs because they've somehow grasped the nature of the thing that they're representing. They're like sculptures or paintings, but much better because they get under, they get the substance or essence of the thing. And one last thing about concepts that makes them very difficult to talk about, but not easy to use, is concepts are like windows. We look right through them. When you look through a window on a clear day, you just see what's out there, right? A beautiful window, you see the trees and the grass out there, and you don't see the glass. I mean, you don't focus on the glass unless there's some terrible glare or something. You just see right through it. Well, our concepts are like that. We see right through them to grasp reality. And we don't think about the concept. And in fact, when we try and think about it, like right now, we find out it's really difficult to think about the concept. But it's really easy to think about reality. In other words, we do it naturally. So our concepts are like these windows. We see right through them to see reality. But when we want to think about the window, it's more difficult. And that's what we call it logic, is thinking about concepts. And it's arduous. Okay. All right, now I'm going to make it still more arduous. Ask your in advance. Apologize in advance. We said there were three operations of the mind: grasping concepts, making judgments, and reasoning. Now we're still in the first level, grasping concepts. There are three ways of grasping concepts. Philosophers always do this. They always say there are three kinds or three ways analyzing. So there are three kinds of abstraction. There's one kind of abstraction that we do all the time that's easy for us, for everybody, and that's natural, abstracting the natures of things. Tree, dog, zebra, cow. You go to the zoo or just Adam on the day of creation. In Genesis chapter 2, what was the first thing that God did with Adam? He brought to Adam all the animals that he had made, and Adam named them, right? Zebra, cow, dog, and he didn't find one similar to himself. He understood all the different animals. So that's simple apprehension. That's the first operation of the mind. That's natural abstraction. Abstracting the natures of things. So you can see Adam, right from the beginning, was rational. He was grasping the natures of things and naming them. So that's the first kind of abstraction. Then there's another that's slightly harder, and that's when we strip away more. So when I grasp, say, pig or cow, I'm stripping away everything that's individual to this particular cow. But I'm keeping some kind of sensible thing. A pig has to have a body. It has to have a body of a certain size. It has to like to wallow in the mud. It has to oink and eat. And so it has to have a certain kind of body. And so I abstract any particular pig, but I have to keep a certain kind of body that's proper to a pig. But we can abstract even more than that. And that's what mathematicians do. They strip away any kind of body or any kind of matter. And so a pig's got to have a certain kind of matter, flesh and bones. But a triangle doesn't have to have any kind of matter. A triangle doesn't have to be red or green or iron or wooden. I abstract everything. All I keep is quantity, and I abstract all sensible reality. So that's a higher level of abstraction, and that's why it's more arduous, and not everybody feels comfortable doing it. And you have to get in the habit of doing it, and get the habit of mathematics, because it's a higher abstraction. And most mathematicians or scientists will think that's the highest. No, that they're the top, they have the highest kind of abstraction, and that's not true. There's a higher kind of abstraction, which we call metaphysical abstraction, which is what philosophers do. Everybody does this. No, they put their own profession at the top. But this really is. Metaphysical abstraction abstracts. Now, in mathematics, you're dealing with quantity, and it could be in any kind of matter. But there's got to be some matter, because you can't have a triangle without any matter at all. Every quantity has to be in matter. It doesn't matter what kind of matter, but it's got to be in some matter. And so the mathematician is still tied to matter somehow, because his mathematics only deals with the material universe. But the philosopher, the metaphysician, doesn't stop there. He can think about things that transcend the physical universe. And that's why we call it metaphysical. Have you ever wondered what metaphysics means? After physics, literally, in Greek. Meta means after or beyond. And so metaphysics is above or beyond the physical. And after it, because first you have to start with the physical. All our knowledge begins with our senses. Right? So we have to start with sense knowledge. And so metaphysics comes afterwards. You don't start first grade teaching metaphysics to your kids. They'll not come back. But don't wait for college either. Okay, so metaphysics is going beyond the physical world. And the mathematician can't do it. But the philosopher does it, and common sense does it. All of us, when we talk about, say, angels. Well, angels are metaphysical realities. They're beyond the physical. And so the notion spiritual is a metaphysical notion. It transcends the physical world. God transcends the physical world. So I can grasp the idea of God because I can do metaphysical abstraction. So what is metaphysical abstraction? Metaphysical abstraction is stripping away not only the particular matter of this pig or that pig, and stripping away not only any kind of matter, iron or wood or green or red, but stripping away all dependence on matter altogether. A materialist will tell you, well, there is nothing. But why? Because he's falling to the classic mistake of relying too much on his imagination. We can't imagine anything immaterial because our imagination is limited to dimension. But we can think immaterial things by stripping away matter and any dependence on matter. And we do it all the time. For example, our notion of truth is immaterial. Right? There's no matter in truth. Truth transcends the material world. It's a metaphysical notion, and everybody can do it. But it's hard to think about it. But we all do it. And another example is, say, beauty. Because some beauty is physical, but there's other beauty that's not. So, for example, the beauty, obviously, the beauty of a body is physical. But the beauty of, say, a beautiful moral action, self-sacrifice, the mother who sacrifices herself for her kids, a spouse sacrificing himself for the family, etc. God creating the world out of pure love. Right? That's beautiful, but it's not physical. Right? So our notion of beauty isn't tied to the physical world. And this is what makes man man. Right? This is what makes us made in God's image, is that we're not tied to the physical universe. We can go above it. We can do metaphysics. We can do metaphysical abstraction. And not only metaphysicians do metaphysical abstraction, every human being does. Even the materialist philosopher who thinks he can't. Because he too uses the word truth. He too maybe would, he too will use the word justice to mean something beyond anything physical. Right? So that's metaphysical abstraction, grasping ideas that aren't dependent on matter. Right? And we all have that capacity, and no chimp ever will do that. Ever. Right? And that's why in the animal world, there are no temples, there are no churches, and there's no burial. Right? You'll never see a tombstone made by a monkey. Or any kind of representation of the Creator. Right? Because they're tied to the particular. They can't do any abstraction, let alone metaphysical abstraction. But wherever you find human bones, what do you find? Archaeologists say wherever they discover a cranium that's the human, that Homo sapiens, you'll find burial. You'll find rites, religious rites, evidence of it in the archaeological remains. Always. So wherever you find man, you find religion, because man's metaphysical. Because we can go above the material world. And we'll talk more about that later. And so it's so important to defend man's capacity for metaphysics, to transcend the material world. It's what gives us our dignity. That's what makes us made in God's image. And the Scripture speaks about that capacity. For example, in the book of Wisdom, chapter 13, there's a beautiful section on how the idolater, the person who worships, say, physical forces, the worship of the sun and the moon and the stars and the rocks and trees, is unreasonable and thus sinful, because it's unreasonable. Because we should be able to recognize the invisible maker of all these things through his visible works. In other words, we're able to do metaphysics. We're able to go from the material to its designer, from the things that we see to the unseen maker. And St. Paul also speaks about this in his letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 20. He says, they have no excuse. He's speaking about the Greek idolaters. And they have no excuse, because from the things that were made, we can grasp, see with the mind, their Creator and His invisible attributes, omnipotence and goodness and reason, etc. And the First Vatican Council defined this as a truth of faith, that human reason alone can grasp God's existence by metaphysics. Now, not everyone, obviously, is formed to do so in a rigorous way, but everyone can do so in a common sense way, because we all know that when you see, say, an artwork, there was a designer, right? You look at the cathedral and you can grasp, well, there was an architect. It didn't just happen. Well, if the basilica didn't just happen, how could I think that the world just happened? Everybody can do that, but it requires metaphysical abstraction to think of a cause that transcends the physical world and is the creator of this world. Okay, let's look now at the second just very quickly, the second and third operation. So we said the second operation of the mind is to make a judgment, to put together two concepts. And we call that a proposition or a sentence. And it's there where we affirm or deny something. This is a man, this is a donkey, this is not, whatever. And it's there where we express truth. The first operation, when we grasp the nature of things, dog, cow, truth, beauty, justice, whatever it may be, we're expressing an essence, but we're not yet expressing truth or falsity. Truth or falsity comes when we make a judgment. This is or this is not. And so we grasp truth through making judgments. And we do it all day long. And what is truth? Well, it's when my judgment is in conformity with reality. This is so important. Every one of us should be able to explain what truth is. No, because in this world today, we'll talk more about this next time. We know in our world, that's one of... a famous person said that at a very famous occasion. Pontius Pilate. Jesus, the truth was in front of him. And he was saying, I came into the world to give witness to the truth. And what does Pontius Pilate say? What is truth? And he's asking as if there's no answer. Right? Just instead of listening to the truth, who was right there. What is truth? And so it's very simple. Truth is conformity. The conformity between my judgment and reality. And so there's truth if my judgment corresponds to reality, and there's falsehood if my judgment doesn't correspond to reality. In other words, in a judgment, I put together two things. This is a human being. And there's truth if this and human being go together in reality. And there's falsehood if it's not a human being, it's a cow in reality. And so truth is the correspondence of our thoughts and judgments with reality. And so part of the nobility, the tremendous nobility of man, is that we can judge. We can judge truth. If we couldn't do that, there would be no morality, because we'd never be able to judge whether something was good or evil. Right? So right in the beginning of Genesis, we see when God gave them a commandment, they could judge what they were to do and what they were not to do. And that's what defines us, as human, as rational animal, as made in God's image. And no dog will ever be able to do that. Right? They'll never be able to judge. This is true. This is false. This is right, and this is wrong. Okay, let's look at the third operation of... We'll talk more about this next time. We'll look at first principles and the foundation of morality next time. Okay, let's look at the third, just briefly, reasoning. We said reasoning is the third operation of the mind by which we go from two judgments to pull out a third. All men are mortal. I'm a man. I am mortal. And so we could say it's grasping that something else follows from what we already know. And so we're not getting something from nothing. We're getting something from what we already have. We're pulling out something that's hidden in what we already know. Right? So for example, if I know that all men are mortal, and I know that I'm a man, I know that I am mortal. But maybe I have to pull it out for myself, because maybe I don't want to look at that. Maybe I want to think that I'm immortal. Right? So reasoning is doing just that. Starting with something. You can't reason if you don't know anything. You can only reason if you know something. And something solid. Right? And we all do, and we'll talk about that next time. And reasoning is proper to human beings. It's only human beings reason. No animal reasons. And angels and God don't reason either, because they don't need to. Because they know in a higher way. Right? So reasoning is proper to us. Now, we may, and everyone does it too, we may reason badly, but every human being at the age of reason reasons all the time, for good or for bad. Right? So it's proper to us. And why is it proper to us? Angels and God don't reason because they know not discursively. What do we mean? To know discursively is to go from one thing to another. It's like walking with the mind. I start with something I know, and I walk to something that's hidden in what I know, but I didn't yet. I'm pulling something out and making explicit what was only implicit. So it's like walking. I'm going from here to there. An angel doesn't need to do that, because he's already there. From the start, he's filled. And obviously, God doesn't need to do that, right? Because he's omniscient. So God doesn't reason. Reasoning is a great thing, but it implies a limitation. It implies that I have to grow. It implies that I have to walk to get somewhere. Whereas God's everywhere. Right? So he doesn't reason. And so reasoning is how we build up. It's how we build all the sciences. It's how we build up morality. It's how we build up culture. It's how we build up technology and the arts and philosophy and theology. And it's possible, and we'll talk about that next time, because we know first principles by nature. There's a foundation. And that'll be our subject next time. And so reasoning is our definition, a rational animal, a reasoning animal. And we can reason because we first have concepts, and then we make judgments, and then we can put them together to draw out a conclusion, and then build human culture. Right? And so all of human culture is building on the shoulders of those who come before by reasoning on the basis of what others have already reasoned on. Right? And that's what man is not an island. We're so much a social creature because all our reasoning depends on other reasoning. Right? And that's the human family hangs together in that, in culture. Anyway, we'll come, so I'm going to leave it here for tonight, and then next time we'll look at what's the foundation of this, first principles, and we'll deal with the objections, skepticism, and how we can answer skepticism and relativism. Right, next time. All right, so let's take a break now, and then there'll be the refreshments, and then questions and answers. And so the way we do it is just write out on a sheet of paper your question, and then I'll read it, and it'll all get recorded.